William Hart had long since accepted that the remaining years of his life would be spent in the same solitary pattern that had defined the 8 years since his wife. Catherine died of consumption, rising before dawn, working his modest cattle ranch with mechanical efficiency, eating alone, sleeping fitfully, and repeating the cycle without variation or hope that anything would ever change. At 50, he felt ancient, worn down less by physical age than by the weight of isolation he had chosen as protection against further loss. He spoke to no one, welcomed no visitors, and maintained his property with the kind of ruthless functionality that required no joy, no companionship, no human connection whatsoever. On a particularly cold morning in late October, William was heading to his barn to begin the day's chores when he noticed something wrong. The door stood slightly ajar when he knew he had secured it the previous night. His first thought was that an animal had somehow gotten inside, perhaps seeking shelter from the dropping temperatures. But when he pushed the door fully open and stepped into the dim interior, what he found was not an animal but a human child, an Apache girl who looked to be about 13 years old, sitting perfectly still on a hay bale, her dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made William stop mid-step. She wore traditional clothing that was worn and inadequate for the cold. Her long black hair was tangled and dirty, and her thin frame suggested she had been without adequate food for some time. But what struck William most forcefully was her complete silence. She made no sound of greeting or alarm, offered no explanation for her presence, simply sat and watched him as if waiting for something he could not begin to guess. William stood frozen for a long moment, trying to understand what he was seeing and what it meant for his carefully maintained solitude. Finally, William spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "What are you doing here? How did you get in my barn?" The girl continued staring at him without responding, without even acknowledging through gesture or expression that she had heard his questions. William tried again, speaking more slowly and clearly in case language was the barrier. "Do you understand English? Do you need help?" Still nothing, just that unwavering, unsettling stare that made William profoundly uncomfortable in ways he could not quite articulate. He approached cautiously, and the girl made no movement to flee or defend herself, simply tracked his approach with her eyes, while remaining otherwise motionless. William examined her more closely and saw signs of recent trauma, bruising on her arms that had faded to yellowish green, suggesting they were several weeks old, and a haunted quality in her expression that spoke of experiences no child should endure. He also noticed she seemed to be deliberately not speaking rather than unable to speak. Her throat moved occasionally as if she was swallowing, and her breathing made normal sounds, but her lips remained firmly sealed, as if she had made a conscious decision that speech was no longer possible or permissible for her. William's first instinct was to ride to the nearest settlement and report finding her, to let authorities handle the situation so he could return to his isolation. But something stopped him, perhaps the memory of his own daughter, who had died at age 9 from the same consumption that took Catherine, or perhaps simply recognition that turning this traumatized child over to frontier authorities would likely result in treatment that would add to rather than alleviate her suffering. Against all his protective instincts and his carefully maintained emotional distance, William heard himself speaking. "You're cold and hungry. Come to the house. I'll make food." The girl stood and followed him without hesitation, moving with a silence that was almost eerie. Her footsteps made no sound despite the dried leaves and debris scattered across the yard. Inside his house, William awkwardly prepared a simple meal while she sat at his table, watching everything he did with that same intense, unnerving focus. When he placed food in front of her, she ate with obvious hunger but with careful, controlled movements, never taking her eyes off him, always seeming to assess and calculate something he could not decipher. After she finished eating, William tried again to get some explanation or response. "Where did you come from? Where is your family? Why are you alone?" Each question was met with the same absolute silence, and William felt frustration building alongside his discomfort. He told her directly that she couldn't stay, that he lived alone and wanted no complications, that she needed to leave, or he would be forced to take her to authorities who could place her somewhere appropriate. But even as he spoke these words, William recognized they rang hollow. He had already brought her into his house, had already fed her, had already involved himself in whatever situation she represented. The girl's response to his dismissal was to simply stand and walk back out to the barn, where she returned to the hay bale and resumed her position of silent waiting. William followed her, his irritation mixing with a growing sense that he was dealing with something beyond his understanding or control. He told her again she needed to leave, but she made no acknowledgement of his words, and William found himself unwilling to physically force her departure. He returned to his house troubled and uncertain, planning to ignore her presence and hoping she would simply leave on her own once she realized he was serious about not wanting her there. But when William returned to the barn that evening for his routine livestock check, the girl was still there, sitting in exactly the same position. And when he checked again before bed, she remained, apparently content to spend the night in the cold barn rather than leave the property. William brought her blankets with gruff instructions to at least stay warm if she was going to be stubborn, and the girl accepted the blankets with a slight nod, the first real acknowledgement she had given that she understood his words even if she refused to respond to them. Over the next several days, an uncomfortable pattern developed. The girl, William still didn't know her name and she showed no inclination to provide it, remained in the barn, eating the food William grudgingly provided, but otherwise asking for nothing and explaining nothing. She began helping with chores without being instructed, performing tasks with a competence that suggested she had learned ranch work before whatever trauma had stolen her voice. William found himself increasingly unsettled by her presence, but also increasingly unable to take the definitive action of forcing her to leave or reporting her to authorities. A week after her arrival, William's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Patterson who lived 15 miles south, stopped by unexpectedly and discovered the girl's presence. Patterson's questions were pointed and suspicious. Where had she come from? Did William know who she was? Was he aware that harboring an Apache child could bring trouble from multiple directions? William answered honestly that he knew almost nothing about her except that she had appeared in his barn and refused to leave, and that he had been too. He searched for the right word, indecisive, to force the issue one way or another. Patterson warned William that he was asking for complications, that people would talk and authorities would question his judgment, that a 50-year-old bachelor living with a young Apache girl would attract exactly the kind of attention and suspicion that William's isolated life had been designed to avoid. William knew Patterson was right, knew he should make a decision rather than continuing this limbo of having the girl present, but not actually accepting responsibility for her. But when Patterson left and William went to the barn to confront the situation, he found the girl had left him a gift, a small carved figure of a horse, created from a piece of scrap wood using tools she must have found in his barn, demonstrating both skill and patience in its creation. The gesture, offered without words or demands, somehow broke through William's resistance more effectively than any plea or explanation could have. This silent Apache girl had claimed his barn as her refuge, had appointed herself as unpaid helper on his ranch, and had just demonstrated that she was capable of creating beauty from scraps, all without speaking a single word or asking for anything beyond the basic tolerance of her presence. William stood in his barn holding the carved horse and finally acknowledged what he had been avoiding for a week. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't going to make her leave, and he needed to stop pretending this was a temporary situation he could ignore until it resolved itself. William made his acceptance of the girl's permanent presence official by doing what he should have done from the beginning. He brought her fully into the house rather than letting her sleep in the cold barn. He showed her to the room that had been his daughter's, which he had left essentially unchanged since her death 9 years ago, and which now would serve its intended purpose again for a child who needed shelter. The girl examined the room carefully, touching the furniture and the few toys that remained, and William saw something shift in her expression, not quite a smile, but a softening of the perpetual wariness she carried. Over the following weeks, William and the silent girl developed a functional relationship built entirely on observation, gesture, and mutual adaptation rather than on verbal communication. She learned his routines and preferences through watching, adjusted her help to match his needs without requiring instruction, and proved herself remarkably capable at tasks that would have challenged many adults. William, for his part, learned to read her subtle expressions and body language, to understand when she was troubled or satisfied, to communicate what he needed through demonstration rather than explanation. William still didn't know her name or her history. She offered no information, and he had stopped asking questions that would only be met with silence. But he began calling her Ista, after observing her habit of standing perfectly still and watching everything with those intense dark eyes. The name meant eyes in what little Apache he knew from occasional traders, and though he had no way to know if she approved or objected to the name, she seemed to accept it as her designation in his household. The isolation that had defined William's life for 8 years began shifting as Ista's presence forced him back into patterns of human interaction. He found himself cooking actual meals rather than just eating whatever was easiest, maintaining the house with more care since someone else was living in it, and even speaking aloud occasionally, despite receiving no verbal responses, just to fill the silence that now felt oppressive rather than comforting, as it had during his years alone. He told Ista about his wife and daughter, about how their deaths had broken something in him that he had never been able to repair, and though she made no reply, her attentive silence felt like a form of witness that validated his grief rather than dismissing it. About 2 months after Ista's arrival, William received an unexpected visit from a federal agent who was investigating reports of Apache children who had gone missing from various relocation efforts and forced school placements. The agent's questions were direct. Had William seen any native children in the area? Was he aware of his legal obligations to report such encounters? William answered carefully, acknowledging that he had indeed taken in an Apache girl who appeared at his property, claiming her as his ward to forestall any attempt to remove her. The agent was skeptical, but ultimately accepted William's assertion, though he warned that formal guardianship papers would need to be filed if William intended to maintain the arrangement permanently. After the agent departed, William sat Ista down, or more accurately, sat down near where she was working, and explained what would be required to make her presence legally secure. He told her honestly that he knew nothing about her past, that he was making certain assumptions about her being an orphan or a runaway who had nowhere else to go, and that if she had family seeking her, she needed to indicate that somehow so he wasn't interfering with a reunion that should happen. Ista's response was to shake her head firmly, the most direct communication she had ever offered, and to remain planted exactly where she was, making clear through posture and expression that she had no intention of leaving regardless of any legal complications. William filed for guardianship, working with a lawyer in the county seat who was bemused but ultimately sympathetic to William's situation. The process required testimony, documentation, and substantial effort to overcome bureaucratic resistance to recognizing an Apache child as the legal ward of a white rancher. But William persisted, with a determination that surprised him, recognizing that his commitment to protecting Ista was forcing him to engage with a world he had been avoiding for nearly a decade. The guardianship was eventually approved, giving Ista legal status as William's ward and giving William formal responsibility for her care and upbringing. With the legal relationship established, William began teaching Ista not just ranch work, but also the broader knowledge she would need to survive in a world that would always view her with some degree of suspicion or hostility due to her Apache heritage. He taught her to read and write using his daughter's old books, discovering that she learned quickly despite her continued refusal to speak. He taught her arithmetic and basic business principles, believing she should understand the economic realities of ranch management. Most importantly, he taught her that she had value and deserved respect, regardless of what traumas had stolen her voice or what prejudices others might carry. Ista reciprocated by slowly allowing William to see beyond her silence to the person underneath. She began leaving him small gifts, carved figures, carefully arranged flowers, once a sketch drawn in charcoal that captured his morning routine with surprising accuracy. These wordless offerings communicated affection and gratitude more effectively than speech might have, and William found himself treasuring them as evidence that he mattered to someone, that his existence had meaning beyond just not dying, that the connection he had been avoiding for years was actually what he had needed orally. Along one significant moment came during a severe winter storm when both William and Esther were trapped inside the house for 3 days. The forced proximity without the buffer of outdoor work made their relationship feel different, more intimate, more explicitly familial. William read aloud from books, while Esther listened and worked on her sewing, creating a domestic scene that reminded him painfully of evenings with Catherine and their daughter. At one point, overcome by memory and by the unexpected comfort of not being alone, William broke down crying, something he had not allowed himself to do since the first months after his family's deaths. Esther's response was immediate and instinctive. She moved to sit beside him, took his hand and stayed there until his grief subsided. The simple gesture of comfort, offered without words but with complete sincerity, affected William more deeply than any verbal consolation could have. He understood in that moment that Esther's silence was not rejection or indifference, but rather a different mode of communication, and that her inability or unwillingness to speak did not diminish the depth of her feelings or the reality of the bond developing between them. As winter gave way to spring, and Esther approached her first full year on William's ranch, both of them had transformed significantly from who they had been when she first appeared in his barn. William had emerged from the isolation and depression that had defined his existence, rediscovering purpose through caring for someone who needed him and who had chosen him, despite all logic, as her refuge and her family. Esther had healed in ways that went beyond the physical recovery from whatever traumas she had endured. She had found safety, stability, and most importantly, unconditional acceptance from someone who never demanded she explain herself or become anything other than who she was. The ranch that had been William's refuge from grief became Esther's permanent home, then her children's inheritance, then a legacy that lasted generations, all because a silent Apache girl had waited in a barn with absolute certainty, and because a lonely rancher had eventually recognized that her certainty was actually the answer to questions he had stopped asking himself years before. Sometimes, the stories concluded, the most profound truths required no words at all, only the courage to claim what you needed and the wisdom to recognize when you were being claimed in return. 5 years had passed since that autumn morning, when William found Esther in his barn, and the ranch had become something he never could have imagined during his years of solitary grief. A thriving operation built on the silent partnership between a man who had forgotten how to hope and a girl who had chosen him with inexplicable certainty. Esther was now 18, had grown into a young woman whose competence at ranch management rivaled William's own, and whose continued silence had become simply part of who she was, rather than a puzzle requiring solution or a problem demanding intervention. The seasonal rhythms of ranch life had taken on new meaning with Esther's presence. Spring brought calving season, which they managed together with practiced efficiency, William handling the difficult births, while Esther monitored the herd and identified problems before they became critical. Summer meant long days of fence repair, water management, and preparing for the brutal heat that could kill cattle if not properly anticipated. Autumn was roundup and preparation for winter, with both of them working from dawn until well past dark to ensure everything was secure before the first serious cold arrived. Winter brought its own challenges of feeding livestock through storms and maintaining equipment, but also brought quieter evenings when William read aloud while Esther worked on whatever project currently occupied her hands. William had developed an entire secondary language for communicating with Esther, not sign language in any formal sense, but rather a personal vocabulary of gestures, expressions, and understood meanings that allowed them to coordinate complex work without her ever needing to speak. He could read her body language to know when she was troubled or satisfied, tired or energized, agreeing or disagreeing with his suggestions. She, in turn, had learned to interpret his moods and needs with uncanny accuracy, often addressing problems before he had fully articulated them even to himself. The community's attitude toward their unusual household had gradually shifted from suspicion and disapproval to grudging respect. Neighboring ranchers who had initially questioned William's judgment now sought Esther's expertise on livestock management, and her innovative approaches to water conservation. The fact that she never spoke had ceased to be the primary thing people noticed about her. Instead, they recognized her competence, her reliability, and her quiet dignity that commanded respect despite her youth and her Apache heritage. Several young men from both white and native families had expressed interest in courting her, but Ista had shown no inclination toward any of them, seeming content with her life on William's ranch and uninterested in the complications that marriage would introduce. One significant challenge arose when a new territorial administrator arrived with plans to enforce stricter regulations on native peoples living outside official reservation boundaries. The administrator questioned the legitimacy of William's guardianship arrangement, suggesting it might be a cover for something improper, and threatened to remove Ista for proper placement under government supervision. William's response was immediate and forceful. He produced all the legal documentation of his guardianship, provided testimony from neighbors about the appropriateness of their relationship, and hired a lawyer to fight any attempt to separate them. The conflict dragged on for months, with William spending money he could ill afford on legal fees and making trips to the territorial capital to argue his case before officials who viewed him with varying degrees of sympathy and skepticism. Throughout this ordeal, Ista remained characteristically silent, but clearly anxious about the possibility of being forced to leave the only home she had known for 5 years. William repeatedly assured her that he would not allow her to be taken, that they would fight through every available legal channel, and that if necessary, they would simply disappear together rather than accept forced separation. The resolution came unexpectedly when one of the Apache elders who occasionally visited submitted formal testimony to the territorial administration stating that Ista's silence was a recognized spiritual practice within their tradition, that her placement with William Hart was accepted and approved by her own people, and that removing her would violate both territorial law regarding guardianship and federal obligations to respect native cultural practices. The combination of legal standing, community support, and the invocation of native religious freedom proved sufficient to end the administrator's challenge. Though William understood the victory was likely temporary, there would always be someone questioning their arrangement, always be another bureaucrat who saw a problem requiring intervention rather than a functional family that defied conventional categories. As this crisis passed and life returned to normal patterns, William found himself thinking about mortality and legacy with new urgency. He was 55 now, still healthy and capable, but acutely aware that his years were limited and that Ista's long-term security needed to be established beyond simply legal guardianship. He consulted with his lawyer about options for ensuring the ranch would pass to her without complication, worked on documentation that would withstand any future challenges to her ownership, and generally tried to prepare for a future when she would need to manage entirely without him. These preparations forced conversations, or more accurately, William's monologues with Ista's attentive listening, about practical matters that had been easy to avoid when thinking about them felt too distant to require immediate attention. William explained the ranch's finances, the relationships with buyers and suppliers that sustained their operations, the political dynamics of regional ranching networks, and the countless details that converted raw land and livestock into sustainable livelihood. Ista absorbed all this information with her characteristic intensity, and William could see her processing and integrating knowledge that would serve her when responsibility fell entirely on her shoulders. One evening, as they completed another of these educational sessions, William spoke more personally about his feelings and his gratitude. He told Ista that finding her in his barn that autumn morning had saved his life in the most literal sense, that he had been slowly dying through isolation and depression, and that her inexplicable decision to claim him and his ranch as her refuge had given him reason to re-engage with existence. He acknowledged that he had resisted her presence initially, had tried to maintain the emotional distance that protected him from further loss, but that her absolute certainty about belonging there had eventually overcome his resistance and had taught him that healing was possible even after devastating loss. William continued, saying that he had spent years trying to understand why she had chosen his barn specifically, what she had seen in him that made her so certain he was the right person to claim as family. He had concluded that perhaps she had recognized in his isolation and grief something that mirrored her own trauma and silence, that they were both damaged in ways that made them incomprehensible to others, but that made them perfectly comprehensible to each other. Their mutual brokenness had created compatibility that conventional wholeness could never have achieved. As William spoke, Ista rose from her chair and moved to stand beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder in a gesture she had developed over the years to communicate affection and reassurance. She met his eyes with her characteristic intense gaze, and though she said nothing, she never said anything, her expression conveyed understanding and reciprocal gratitude that needed no verbal articulation. They stood together in the quiet evening, the silence between them not empty but rather full of shared history and mutual recognition, and William felt profound peace with how his life had unfolded, despite all the loss and pain that had seemed like it would define his entire existence. The years continued accumulating, and the ranch continued prospering through their joint efforts. William's hair turned fully gray, his movements slowed, and the physical labor of ranching gradually shifted more completely to Ista, while he focused on planning and business management. They hired occasional help during peak seasons, but the core operation remained theirs alone. The silent partnership that had developed from that first inexplicable morning in the barn, and that had proven more durable and more functional than many conventional relationships built on shared language and explicit communication. When William was 62, a serious illness struck, pneumonia that might have killed a younger man, and that left him weakened even after recovery. During his illness, Ista managed the entire ranch operation without missing a step, demonstrating conclusively that she was fully capable of independent management and that his years of teaching had been successful. But more than her competence, William was moved by her nursing care during his recovery, the way she sat with him through fevered nights, the patience with which she helped him relearn strength, the obvious fear in her eyes during the worst days when his survival seemed uncertain. After his recovery, William made final arrangements with his lawyer to ensure that upon his death, the ranch and all its assets would pass directly to Ista with documentation so comprehensive that no future challenge could succeed in displacing her. He discussed these arrangements with her openly, and though the conversations about his inevitable mortality clearly distressed her, she listened with the same focused attention she brought to everything he taught her. William emphasized that the ranch was hers not just legally but morally. She had made it what it was through her labor and her presence, and his death would simply formalize what had been true for years.